But that was before I met Patricia Henderson, the HOA president who lived 3 houses down from me in our suburban Minnesota neighborhood. It started on a Tuesday morning in late January when I woke up to find nearly 18 inches of fresh snow blanketing our quiet street in Edna, a suburb just outside Minneapolis. I had lived in this community for 2 years now, and while the winters were brutal, I had grown accustomed to the routine of bundling up and clearing my driveway before heading to my job as an electrical engineer at a manufacturing plant downtown. The snow had stopped falling around dawn, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that would have been beautiful if it did not mean 2 hours of backbreaking labor before I could even think about my morning coffee. My name is Zachary Wright, and I am 34 years old, single, and generally the kind of guy who keeps to himself. I bought this 3-bedroom colonial because it was in a good neighborhood with decent property values, not because I wanted to be part of some community association that seemed to have an opinion about everything from the color you could paint your mailbox to how many holiday decorations were considered tasteful. The HOA in Meadowbrook Estates was particularly aggressive, with monthly meetings that I avoided like the plague, and a board president who seemed to think her position gave her authority over every aspect of our lives. I had just finished putting on my heaviest winter coat and was heading out to my garage to grab my snow shovel when I heard the sharp rapping of knuckles against my front door. The knocking was insistent, almost aggressive, and I felt my jaw tighten before I even opened the door. Standing on my porch was Patricia Henderson herself, wrapped in a designer parka that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her makeup was flawless. She was probably in her mid-40s, with the kind of pinched expression that suggested she spent most of her time finding fault with the world around her. "Zachary," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I need to discuss your snow removal responsibilities with you." I blinked, still half asleep and not entirely sure I had heard her correctly. "My snow removal responsibilities?" "Yes," Patricia said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a document. According to the HOA bylaws, specifically Section 12.7, homeowners are responsible for maintaining clear walkways not just on their own property, but also on adjacent properties occupied by HOA board members during severe weather events. This is to ensure that board members can fulfill their duties without impediment. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious," Patricia replied, her voice taking on that condescending tone that made my teeth grind. "My house is 3 doors down, as you know, and I have an important HOA meeting this afternoon that I need to prepare for. I expect you to clear my driveway and walkway after you finish your own property. The snow needs to be removed by 10 o'clock this morning." "Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "I have never heard of any such bylaw, and even if it existed, it would be completely unreasonable. I am not your personal snow removal service." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger building behind her carefully maintained facade. "The bylaws were updated 6 months ago at a meeting you did not attend. If you had bothered to participate in your community, you would know about these changes. As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce these rules, and failure to comply will result in fines. $50 per day until the work is completed to my satisfaction." I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest. "Let me see this supposed bylaw." Patricia tapped her phone a few more times and then held it up to show me a densely worded document. I squinted at the small text, trying to make sense of the legalese, but she pulled the phone away before I could read more than a few lines. "You can review the full bylaws at your leisure," she said. "They are posted on the HOA website. But right now, I need you to commit to clearing my property this morning. Will you be complying with the rules, or do I need to start assessing fines?" Every fiber of my being wanted to tell her exactly where she could shove her bylaws. But I also knew that Patricia Henderson was the kind of person who would make my life miserable if I gave her the ammunition. I had heard stories from other neighbors about the petty war she had waged over minor infractions, resulting in constant harassment and mounting fines that were difficult to dispute without hiring a lawyer. "Fine," I said through clenched teeth. "I will take care of it." Patricia's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth whatsoever. "Excellent. I knew you would see reason. I expect the work to be completed by 10 o'clock sharp. Not 10:15, not 10:30. 10 o'clock. She turned on her heel and walked back down my porch steps, navigating the snow with surprising ease in her expensive boots. I watched her get into her black Lexus SUV and drive away, presumably to avoid being present, while I did her manual labor for free. The rage that had been simmering inside me reached a boiling point as I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to collect my thoughts. This was insane. There was no way that bylaw was legitimate, and even if it had somehow been snuck into the rules during a meeting I had missed, it could not possibly be enforceable. But Patricia Henderson was not the kind of person who made empty threats, and I knew that fighting this through official channels would take time and money that I might not have. The HOA had legal funds specifically for disputes like this, while I would be paying out of pocket for any attorney fees. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the HOA website, navigating to the bylaws section. Sure enough, there was an updated document dated 6 months ago. I scrolled through page after page of dense legal text until I found section 12.7. My blood ran cold as I read the actual wording. Homeowners shall maintain clear and safe walkways on their property and shall render reasonable assistance to elderly or disabled neighbors during severe weather events when requested. That was it. That was the actual bylaw. There was nothing about HOA board members, nothing about mandatory snow removal for other properties, nothing that even remotely resembled what Patricia had described to me. She had completely fabricated the requirement, probably banking on the fact that most people would not bother to actually read through dozens of pages of boring legal documents to verify her claims. I felt a different kind of anger now, the cold fury that comes from realizing you have been deliberately deceived. Patricia Henderson had not just asked for a favor or even made an unreasonable request. She had lied to my face and threatened me with fines based on rules that did not exist. She had used her position as HOA president to try to intimidate me into doing her bidding, assuming I would be too lazy or too scared to call her bluff. Well, she had seriously underestimated who she was dealing with. I went to my garage and grabbed my snow shovel, along with my heavy-duty snow blower that I had purchased last winter after getting tired of the back-breaking work of clearing my long driveway by hand. The machine was a beast, capable of throwing snow 30 feet in any direction, and I had gotten quite good at operating it over the past 2 winters. I spent the next 90 minutes clearing my own property, creating neat piles of snow along the edges of my driveway, and ensuring that my walkway was completely clear and safe. By the time I finished, it was 9:30, and I was sweating despite the below-freezing temperature. I stood in my driveway, looking down the street toward Patricia's house. Her black Lexus was parked in her garage, which meant she was home and probably watching from her window to see if I would comply with her fabricated demands. I had a choice to make. I could simply ignore her and go inside, maybe send a polite email explaining that I had reviewed the actual bylaws and would not be providing snow removal services that were not actually required. That would be the mature, reasonable approach. It would also accomplish absolutely nothing, because Patricia would simply find another way to harass me, inventing new violations and making my life in this neighborhood progressively more unbearable. Or I could give her exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. I fired up my snow blower again and began the walk down to Patricia's house. Her property was similar to mine, with a long driveway leading to a two-car garage and a curved walkway connecting the driveway to her front porch. The entire area was covered in the same 18 inches of snow that had blanketed the rest of the neighborhood, and it would take at least an hour to clear it properly. I started with her driveway, running the snow blower up and down the length of it and directing the snow discharge to create enormous piles on either side. The machine roared as it chewed through the heavy snow, throwing it high into the air in perfect arcs. I worked methodically, making sure to clear every inch of the concrete, exactly as Patricia would expect. When I finished with the driveway, I moved on to the walkway, clearing a path from the street all the way to her front door. By the time I was done, it was 11:15, which meant I had technically missed her arbitrary deadline, but I doubted she would complain given that I had actually done the work. Her property looked pristine, with clear concrete surfaces and perfectly formed snowbanks on either side. And then I turned my attention to her garage door. The garage was at the end of her driveway, with two large white doors that opened outward. I had cleared the driveway right up to those doors, which meant there was now a narrow channel of bare concrete leading directly to them. I repositioned my snow blower at the end of the driveway, aimed it directly at the garage doors, and began making slow, deliberate passes back and forth. The snow blower threw its payload with impressive force, and I watched with satisfaction as massive amounts of snow began to accumulate against the garage doors. I made pass after pass, each time adding more snow to the growing pile. The discharge chute on my machine could throw snow nearly 30 feet, which meant I could stand at a comfortable distance and still deliver impressive volume to my target. After about 20 minutes, I had created a snow wall against Patricia's garage doors that was at least 5 feet high and stretched the entire width of the two-car garage. I had used all of the snow from her driveway and walkway, plus additional snow from her front lawn, to construct this impressive barrier. The pile was packed densely from the force of the snow blower, which meant it would not be easy to remove. She would need to shovel it away by hand or wait for it to melt, which in Minnesota in January could take weeks. I stood back to admire my handiwork. From the street, Patricia's property looked odd, with a perfectly clear driveway leading to an enormous pile of snow that completely blocked access to her garage. The Lexus that was currently inside the garage would not be going anywhere until that snow was removed. I was just shutting off my snow blower when Patricia's front door flew open, and she came storming out, still in her designer parka, but now with an expression of absolute fury on her face. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she shrieked, her voice carrying down the quiet street and probably alerting every neighbor within earshot. "Clearing your walkway," I said calmly, refusing to let her see how much satisfaction I was deriving from this moment. "Just like you demanded. You piled all the snow against my garage door." Patricia's face was turning red, and I could see a vein throbbing in her temple. "I cannot get my car out." "Well, the bylaw you cited said I needed to clear your walkway and driveway," I replied, keeping my tone professional. It did not specify where I should put the snow. I had to put it somewhere, and this seemed like the most efficient option. "This is sabotage," Patricia shouted. "This is deliberate property damage. Actually, it is just snow," I said. "Snow that fell from the sky and that I relocated from one part of your property to another. No damage at all." Patricia's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment, I thought she might actually try to hit me. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started jabbing at the screen with her finger. "I am calling the police," she declared. "This is vandalism and you are going to be arrested." "Go ahead," I said. "While you are at it, maybe you should explain to them about the fake HOA bylaw you invented to try to force me into shoveling your driveway." That stopped her cold. Her finger froze over her phone screen, and I saw the anger in her eyes shift to something else. Calculation, maybe, or fear. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. I pulled out my own phone and opened the HOA website, navigating to the bylaws section. Section 12.7, I read aloud. "Homeowners shall maintain clear and safe walkways on their property, and shall render reasonable assistance to elderly or disabled neighbors during severe weather events when requested." Nothing in there about HOA board members. Nothing about mandatory snow removal for other properties. "You made it up." Patricia's face went through several interesting color changes, from red to white to a sort of mottled purple. "I am the HOA president," she said. "I have the authority to interpret the bylaws as I see fit." "No, you do not," I replied. "You have the authority to enforce the bylaws as written, not to invent new ones out of thin air. What you did this morning was abuse your position to try to intimidate me into providing free labor. That is not interpretation. That is fraud." "You have no idea who you are dealing with," Patricia hissed. "I will make your life in this neighborhood a living hell. I will find every possible violation, every tiny infraction, and I will fine you into bankruptcy. And I will dispute every single one of those fines," I said. "I will request hearings, I will demand documentation, and I will make sure every single homeowner in this neighborhood knows exactly how you operate. How many other people have you pulled this scam on, Patricia? How many neighbors have you bullied into doing your bidding by making up fake rules?" She did not answer, but the expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. I was not the first person she had tried this with, and I probably would not have been the last if I had not called her bluff. "You need to remove this snow," Patricia said, her voice shaking now with barely controlled rage. "You need to remove it right now, or I swear I will—" "You will what?" I interrupted. "Sue me for relocating snow on your property, fine me for complying with your made-up bylaw. Call the police and explain that you are upset because I did exactly what you told me to do." Patricia's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air, and I had to resist the urge to laugh at how completely I had turned the tables on her. "I will be submitting a formal complaint to the HOA board," I said, "about your abuse of authority and your attempt to defraud a homeowner through misrepresentation of the bylaws. I expect there will be a hearing about your conduct as president." "The board will never side with you," Patricia said, but she sounded less confident now. "I have been president for 5 years. They trust my judgment. Then they can hear my side of the story and decide for themselves," I said. "In the meantime, you have a lovely snow pile to deal with. I recommend a good shovel." I turned and began walking back toward my house, pulling my snow blower behind me. I could feel Patricia's eyes boring into my back, and I half expected her to come running after me. But she stayed rooted to her spot on her front walkway, staring at the mountain of snow blocking her garage. When I got home, I went inside and immediately sat down at my computer to document everything that had happened. I wrote out a detailed timeline of Patricia's visit, her fake bylaw citation, my verification of the actual rules, and my subsequent snow removal efforts. I took screenshots of the real bylaw section and saved them to my hard drive. Then, I composed a formal complaint letter to the HOA board, outlining Patricia's misconduct and requesting an investigation into her abuse of authority. I was proofreading the letter when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I did not recognize, but the area code was local, so I answered. "Is this Zachary Wright?" a male voice asked, speaking. "Mr. Wright, this is Officer Daniels with the Edna Police Department. We received a call about a dispute at 847 Maple Ridge Drive." "That is your address, correct?" My heart sank. Patricia had actually called the police. I had been half bluffing when I told her to go ahead, but apparently she had been desperate enough to actually do it. "Yes, that is my address," I said. "Can you tell me about an incident this morning involving snow removal at a neighbor's property?" I took a deep breath and launched into the full story, starting with Patricia's early morning visit and ending with my creative snow relocation. Officer Daniels listened without interrupting, and I could not tell from his tone whether he was sympathetic or annoyed. "So let me make sure I understand," he said when I finished. "Miss Henderson told you that HOA rules required you to shovel her driveway. You checked the actual rules, found out she was lying, but decided to shovel her driveway anyway and then piled all the snow against her garage door." "That is correct," I said. There was a long pause, and then I heard what sounded suspiciously like a muffled laugh. "Mr. Wright, I am going to level with you. We get calls about HOA disputes all the time, and 9 times out of 10, they are complete nonsense that should be handled internally. This situation is no different. You did not damage any property, you did not threaten anyone, and based on what you have told me, Miss Henderson deliberately misrepresented your obligations to try to get free labor out of you. So I am not in trouble." "Not from a legal standpoint, no," Officer Daniels said. "What you did was petty and probably not very nice, but it was not criminal. That said, I would recommend you try to work this out through your HOA's official channels rather than escalating the situation further. These kinds of neighbor disputes can get ugly fast." "I am already drafting a formal complaint to the board," I assured him. "Good. And Mr. Wright, between you and me, I have dealt with Miss Henderson before. She called us last year because someone parked their car 3 inches over the line in a visitor parking spot. Some people just need to feel like they are in control of everything around them." After I hung up with Officer Daniels, I felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The police were not going to arrest me for creative snow disposal, and it sounded like Patricia had a reputation for being difficult that extended beyond our neighborhood. I finished my complaint letter, saved it as a PDF, and sent it to the email address listed on the HOA website for board communications. The rest of the day passed quietly. I made myself lunch, caught up on some work emails, and tried not to think about the mess I had potentially created with my HOA. But as the afternoon wore on, I found myself checking my email obsessively, waiting for some kind of response to my complaint. At 4:30, my inbox finally pinged with a new message. The sender was Robert Martinez, who according to the HOA website was the vice president of the board. The subject line read, "Formal complaint against HOA president." I opened the email with a sense of trepidation. "Mr. Wright, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. The board takes allegations of misconduct very seriously, particularly when they involve potential misrepresentation of our bylaws. We will be scheduling an emergency board meeting for this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. to discuss your complaint. Your presence is requested, but not required. We will also be asking Ms. Henderson to provide her account of the events in question. Regards, Robert Martinez, Vice President, Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I read the email 3 times, trying to parse the formal language for any hint of how the board was leaning. The fact that they were calling an emergency meeting suggested they took my complaint seriously, but it could also mean they were circling the wagons around Patricia. I had no idea what the other board members were like or how much influence Patricia wielded over them. I sent a brief reply confirming that I would attend the meeting, then spent the rest of the evening trying to prepare my case. I printed out copies of the relevant bylaw sections, my timeline of events, and screenshots of my text exchanges with Patricia where she had threatened me with fines. I even drove back past her house to take photos of the snow pile still blocking her garage door, just in case I needed visual evidence. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo. I saw Patricia coming and going from her house a few times, but she must have gotten someone else to remove the snow from her garage because her Lexus was mobile again by Wednesday morning. She did not acknowledge me when our paths crossed, which was fine by me. The Cold War was preferable to open hostility. Thursday evening arrived with surprising speed. I put on business casual clothes, gathered my documentation into a folder, and drove to the community center where HOA meetings were held. The building was a small brick structure at the edge of our development, with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people if everyone squeezed together. When I arrived at 6:50, there were already a dozen people in the room. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood, but did not know most of them by name. Patricia was sitting in the front row, her back ramrod straight, dressed in a severe black pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She did not turn around when I entered, but I saw her shoulders tense. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Robert Martinez was a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. Next to him sat 2 other board members whose names I had learned from the website. Jennifer Cole, the secretary, a thin woman in her 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, and Thomas Bradford, the treasurer, who looked to be in his early 40s with the polished appearance of someone who worked in finance. At 7 o'clock sharp, Robert called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he said. "We are here tonight to address a serious allegation of misconduct involving our HOA president, Patricia Henderson. Mr. Zachary Wright has filed a formal complaint claiming that Miss Henderson misrepresented our bylaws in order to compel him to perform snow removal on her property. We take these allegations very seriously, and we want to give both parties an opportunity to present their version of events." He turned to me. "Mr. Wright, would you like to begin?" I stood up and walked to the front of the room, suddenly very aware of all the eyes on me. Public speaking had never been my strong suit, but I had prepared for this, and I was not going to back down now. On Tuesday morning, January 21st, at approximately 7 a.m., Miss Henderson came to my door, I began, and then launched into the full story. I walked the board through Patricia's claims about Section 12.7, her threats of daily fines, and my subsequent discovery that the bylaw she cited said nothing of the sort. I showed them my printed documentation, passing copies to each board member. Miss Henderson deliberately misrepresented our HOA rules in an attempt to intimidate me into providing free labor, I concluded. When I complied with her request in a way she did not expect, she threatened to fine me and eventually called the police, wasting taxpayer resources on a personal dispute. This is an abuse of her authority as president, and it raises serious questions about how she has been exercising that authority with other homeowners. I sat down, my heart pounding. The room was silent for a moment, and then Robert turned to Patricia. "Miss Henderson, would you like to respond to these allegations?" Patricia stood, and I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. She clasped them in front of her, composing herself before speaking. "Mr. Wright is taking a simple misunderstanding and blowing it out of proportion," she said. "I did visit his home on Tuesday morning to remind him of his snow removal obligations. Section 12.7 does state that homeowners should render reasonable assistance to neighbors during severe weather, and I interpreted that to include my request for help with my own property. I am an active HOA president who works tirelessly for this community, and I believed it was reasonable to ask a fellow homeowner for assistance. Did you tell Mr. Wright that the bylaws specifically required him to clear your property?" Jennifer asked, looking up from the documents I had provided. "I may have phrased it in a way that was unclear," Patricia said, "but my intention was simply to request help as a neighbor, as provided for in the bylaws." "Did you threaten him with $50 daily fines?" Thomas asked. Patricia hesitated. "I may have mentioned the standard fine structure for bylaw violations, yes." "So you told him he was required to clear your driveway, and then threatened him with fines if he did not comply?" Robert said, his voice harder now. "That sounds like more than a request for neighborly assistance." "I was trying to impress upon him the seriousness of community obligations," Patricia said, but she was starting to sound defensive. "Perhaps I was not as clear as I could have been, but my intentions were good." "Your intentions are irrelevant if you were misrepresenting the rules," Jennifer said sharply. "The bylaws are very specific about what is required of homeowners, and there is nothing in Section 12.7 that mandates snow removal for HOA board members. If you wanted help with your driveway, you should have hired a service or asked politely without invoking fake rules and threatening fines." I watched Patricia's face cycle through emotions, finally settling on barely suppressed anger. She had not expected the board to side with me, that much was clear. "Furthermore," Robert continued, "this is not the first complaint we have received about your conduct as president. 3 other homeowners have reached out to board members privately over the past year with concerns about your interpretation of the bylaws and your management style." This was news to me, and apparently to Patricia as well, based on the shocked expression that flashed across her face. "I have served this community faithfully for 5 years, Patricia said, her voice rising. "I have given countless hours of my time to make this neighborhood better, and this is the thanks I get. Some entitled newcomer who cannot be bothered to help his neighbors gets to drag my name through the mud." "Miss Henderson, please sit down," Robert said firmly. "This is not a personal attack. This is about ensuring that our HOA is run fairly and according to the rules we all agreed to follow." Patricia remained standing for another moment, her face flushed, before finally dropping back into her chair with a thud. Robert looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "I think we need to discuss this as a board and determine the appropriate course of action. I am going to ask everyone else to step outside for about 15 minutes while we deliberate." The dozen or so observers filed out of the meeting room, and I followed them into the lobby. Several people came up to me immediately, and I found myself surrounded by neighbors I barely knew. "That was incredibly satisfying to watch," said a man I recognized from 2 streets over. "Patricia tried to fine me last summer because my grass was a 1/4 inch too tall according to her measurements. I had to fight it for 3 months. She sent me a violation notice because my holiday lights were up 2 days past the deadline," a woman added. 2 days. and the fine was $200. The stories kept coming, each one more petty than the last. It became clear that Patricia had been using her position to bully and intimidate homeowners throughout the neighborhood, always staying just on the edge of what the bylaws allowed but interpreting them in the most draconian way possible. I had not realized I was part of such a widespread pattern. After 20 minutes rather than the promised 15, the door to the meeting room opened and Robert called us back inside. Patricia was still sitting in the front row, but her posture had changed. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. "The board has reached a decision," Robert announced once everyone was seated. "After reviewing the evidence and discussing the matter thoroughly, we have determined that Miss Henderson did indeed misrepresent the HOA bylaws in her interaction with Mr. Wright. This constitutes a serious breach of her duties as president." He paused, and I could see Patricia's hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Effective immediately, Patricia Henderson is removed from her position as HOA president. She will remain a homeowner in good standing with all the rights and responsibilities that entails, but she will no longer serve in any leadership capacity within the HOA board. I will be assuming the role of president on an interim basis until we can hold elections next month." The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. Patricia sat frozen, her face completely blank. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and pity. I had wanted accountability, not necessarily to destroy her position in the community, but she had brought this on herself through years of petty tyranny. "Additionally," Robert continued, raising his voice to be heard over the chatter, "the board will be conducting a comprehensive review of all fines assessed over the past 2 years to ensure they were justified under our bylaws. Any homeowner who believes they were wrongly fined is encouraged to submit an appeal, which will be reviewed by myself and the other board members." Patricia finally stood, moving like she was underwater. She walked toward the door without saying a word, and the crowd parted to let her pass. I watched her go, wondering what she was thinking, whether she felt any remorse or just anger at being caught. After she left, several neighbors came up to thank me for standing up to her. I accepted their gratitude awkwardly, not quite sure what to do with all the attention. I had just wanted to clear my own driveway without being bullied into free labor, but apparently I had struck a blow for everyone who had suffered under Patricia's reign. I drove home that night feeling exhausted but vindicated. The situation had escalated far beyond what I had anticipated when I piled snow against Patricia's garage door, but it had also exposed a real problem in our community. Patricia had been abusing her authority for years, and nobody had felt empowered to stop her until I had accidentally become the catalyst for change. The next few weeks passed in a blur of HOA activity. Robert proved to be a much more reasonable president than Patricia, and he instituted several reforms to prevent future abuses of power. The board adopted new rules requiring any fine over $50 to be approved by a majority of board members, rather than just the president. They also created an appeals process that did not require homeowners to hire lawyers just to dispute minor violations. The review of past fines turned up dozens of questionable cases, and the board ended up refunding over $15,000 to homeowners who had been charged for violations that were either not in the bylaws or were interpreted far too strictly. I got my own refund of $300 for a violation. Patricia had assessed me the previous summer for having a package delivery box on my porch for more than 24 hours. As for Patricia herself, she became something of a ghost in the neighborhood. I would occasionally see her leaving her house or returning home, but she never made eye contact with anyone and seemed to be going out of her way to avoid interaction. Some neighbors felt bad for her, saying she had been publicly humiliated and that the punishment might have been too severe. Others, particularly those who had been on the receiving end of her enforcement actions, felt justice had been served. I tried not to think about her too much. My life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after accidentally starting a revolution in my HOA. I went to work, came home, and tried to be a regular neighbor who kept his property maintained and did not cause trouble. About 6 weeks after the board meeting, on a cold Saturday morning in early March, I was in my garage organizing my tools when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked up to see Patricia's black Lexus idling there. My first instinct was to ignore her, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked out to see what she wanted. Patricia rolled down her window but did not get out of the car. She looked different than I remembered, older somehow, with dark circles under her eyes that even her makeup could not quite hide. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. I blinked, not sure I had heard her correctly. "What?" "I said I owe you an apology," Patricia repeated. "What I did was wrong. I abused my authority, I lied to you, and I tried to intimidate you into doing something that was not your responsibility. I am sorry." I stood there, my breath making clouds in the cold air, trying to process this unexpected development. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Why are you telling me this 2 months later?" Patricia looked away, staring at something beyond my shoulder. "Because my therapist said I needed to make amends with the people I have hurt, and because you were right about what you said to the board. I was using my position to bully people. I convinced myself I was just enforcing the rules and making the neighborhood better, but really, I was just trying to control everything because my own life felt out of control." This was far more honesty than I had expected, and I did not quite know how to respond. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully, "but you hurt a lot of people over the years. I am not the only one who deserves to hear this." "I know," Patricia said. "You are just the first. I have a long list to work through." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, and then Patricia put her car in reverse. "I will let you get back to your Saturday," she said. "Thank you for hearing me out." She backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the street. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure that I had not realized I needed. Patricia Henderson had been a nightmare to deal with, but she was also apparently a human being capable of recognizing her mistakes and trying to make amends. That did not erase what she had done, but it was something. Over the following months, the neighborhood continued to heal from the Patricia era. Robert was elected as permanent president in the spring elections, running unopposed after his competent handling of the transition period. Jennifer and Thomas remained as secretary and treasurer, providing continuity and stability. The board recruited 2 new members from the community, both of whom seemed genuinely interested in serving their neighbors rather than exerting control over them. I even attended a few HOA meetings, determined not to let my previous apathy allow another Patricia to take power. The meetings were surprisingly boring without constant drama and overreach, which I decided was probably a good sign. We discussed mundane things like scheduling landscaping services for common areas and planning the annual neighborhood barbecue. It was the kind of community organization that the HOA was supposed to be all along. Patricia kept to herself for most of that spring and summer. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had apologized to several other homeowners and had even offered to reimburse some of them for expenses they had incurred fighting her violations. She stopped coming to HOA meetings entirely, which some people viewed as running away from her problems and others saw as giving the community space to move forward without her presence as a constant reminder. Then, in late August, Patricia's house went up for sale. The sign appeared in her front yard on a Tuesday morning, and by that evening the whole neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Some people thought she was being forced to move because of the scandal. Others believed she had simply decided to make a fresh start somewhere else where nobody knew her history. I ran into Patricia one last time about a week before she moved out. I was walking my neighbor's dog as a favor while they were on vacation, and she was putting boxes in her car. We made eye contact, and for a moment I thought she might pretend not to see me and hurry inside. Instead, she walked over. "Heading somewhere new?" I asked, nodding toward the boxes. "Arizona," Patricia said. "My sister lives in Phoenix, and she has been after me for years to move down there." Seemed like a good time for a change of scenery. "Probably a lot less snow to shovel," I said, and immediately regretted the joke. But Patricia actually laughed, a real laugh that transformed her face. "Yes, that is definitely a selling point, though I have to admit I will miss the seasons." "Minnesota does have nice seasons," I agreed. "All 4 of them in 1 week sometimes." We stood there for a moment, and then Patricia extended her hand. "Thank you for standing up to me," she said. "I needed someone to do that years ago, but everyone was too afraid or too polite." "You did me a favor, even if it did not feel like it at the time." I shook her hand, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I hope Arizona treats you well," I said. "I hope your HOA continues to be boring and functional," Patricia replied. And with that, she walked back to her house, and I continued on my dog walk. It was the last conversation we ever had. Patricia moved out 2 weeks later, and a young family with 3 kids moved into her house that October. They were friendly and normal, and never once tried to make anyone shovel their driveway. Life in Meadowbrook Estates returned to what I assumed was its natural equilibrium. The HOA functioned as it was supposed to, addressing legitimate community concerns without morphing into a petty dictatorship. Neighbors helped each other out when needed, not because they were threatened with fines, but because that was what decent people did. And when the next winter brought another massive snowstorm, I cleared my own driveway and then helped my elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen with hers because she genuinely needed the assistance, not because anyone was trying to force me. The whole incident became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents who moved in after Patricia left would eventually hear the story of the HOA president who tried to force someone to shovel her driveway and ended up with all her snow piled against her garage door. The details would get embellished in each retelling, with some versions claiming I had built a wall 20 feet high or that Patricia had been arrested for fraud. I always corrected the record when I heard these exaggerated versions, wanting people to understand what had actually happened rather than letting it turn into a myth. The real story was dramatic enough without embellishment. A homeowner standing up to abuse of authority, documentation, and bylaws proving that rules matter, and a community finally holding a leader accountable for misconduct. Robert proved to be an excellent HOA president, serving 3 consecutive terms before deciding he had done enough and wanted to focus on his new grandchildren. The board he helped build continued to function effectively, avoiding the extremes of both neglect and overreach. Property values in Meadowbrook Estates remained stable, the common areas stayed well maintained, and disputes were resolved through reasonable dialogue rather than intimidation. As for me, I eventually sold my house in Edna 5 years later when I got a job opportunity in Seattle that was too good to pass up. Before I left, several neighbors threw me a going-away party at the community center, the same room where Patricia had been removed from office. Robert gave a speech thanking me for my service to the community, which I found both touching and slightly absurd given that all I had really done was refuse to be bullied and pile some snow in an inconvenient location. But I understood what he meant. Sometimes standing up to unreasonable authority, even in small ways, can have ripple effects that improve things for everyone. Patricia Henderson had created a toxic environment through years of petty tyranny, and my refusal to participate in that system had been the catalyst for necessary change. I had not set out to be a hero or a revolutionary. I had just wanted to clear my driveway in peace without being subjected to fake bylaws and threats. The snow pile incident became a reminder to everyone in Meadowbrook Estates that HOA board members were supposed to serve their communities, not rule over them. The bylaws existed to maintain order and property values, not to give petty tyrants a weapon to use against their neighbors. And when someone abused their authority, it was everyone's responsibility to speak up rather than hoping someone else would deal with the problem. I thought about Patricia sometimes after I moved to Seattle. I wondered if she had found peace in Arizona, whether her therapy had helped her address whatever issues had driven her need for control. I hoped she had, genuinely. People were complicated, capable of both cruelty and growth, and she had at least shown the courage to apologize and try to make amends. The HOA wars of Meadowbrook Estates taught me several valuable lessons. First, always read the actual bylaws rather than trusting someone else's interpretation, especially when that person has a vested interest in the outcome. Second, documentation is your best defense against people who abuse authority, because the truth matters more than their position or title. Third, standing up to bullies is scary and uncomfortable, but sometimes necessary to prevent them from continuing to hurt others. And finally, the lesson I found most surprising: creative snow placement can be an effective form of protest, as long as you are prepared to deal with the consequences. I never regretted piling that snow against Patricia's garage door. It was petty, sure, and probably not the most mature way to handle the situation. But it also forced a confrontation that needed to happen, exposing years of misconduct and leading to meaningful reforms. Years later, when I would tell the story at dinner parties or to new friends in Seattle, they would usually laugh at the image of this imperious HOA president staring at 5 feet of snow blocking her garage. But the story was about more than just revenge or getting one over on someone who had wronged me. It was about what happens when ordinary people decide they have had enough of being pushed around by those who mistake authority for power. The truth is that HOAs can be valuable organizations when run properly, maintaining property values and organizing collective efforts that benefit everyone. But they can also become vehicles for petty tyranny when the wrong people get control and forget that they are supposed to serve their neighbors, not rule over them. The bylaws and rules exist to protect everyone, including from board members who might abuse their positions. Patricia Henderson was not some cartoon villain, despite how she might come across in the retelling of this story. She was a person who had convinced herself that strict enforcement and total control were the same thing as good leadership. She had lost sight of the fact that rules should serve people, not the other way around. And when I challenged her authority with documentation and creative problem-solving, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. The neighborhood survived and even thrived after her departure. New families moved in, property values continued to rise, and the HOA functioned as it should without constant drama and conflict. The reforms that Robert and the board instituted remained in place, creating safeguards against future abuses of power. And somewhere in Arizona, I hoped Patricia Henderson was living a quieter life, having learned from her mistakes and found better ways to channel her need for order and control. As for me, I carried the experience with me as a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it is uncomfortable. You cannot always predict the consequences of your actions, but doing nothing in the face of injustice is itself a choice, one that allows bad behavior to continue unchecked. The snow pile was a small act of defiance that sparked something larger, a community finally saying enough was enough. I still check in with some of my old neighbors from Meadowbrook Estates occasionally, mostly through social media. They post pictures of neighborhood events, updates about their families, and occasional jokes about the legendary snow pile incident. The community center was renovated last year, and someone joked they should put up a plaque commemorating the spot where HOA tyranny went to die. They did not actually do it, but the fact that people still remembered and found humor in the situation years later suggested it had become part of the neighborhood's collective identity. Robert emailed me a few years ago to let me know that they had used my story as a cautionary tale during HOA board training, teaching new board members about the importance of following actual bylaws rather than inventing convenient interpretations. Apparently, it had become a standard part of their orientation process, along with other examples of what not to do when serving in community leadership positions. I found it both amusing and gratifying that my petty act of snow-based revenge had been elevated to an educational tool. The whole experience changed how I thought about community involvement and civic responsibility. In Seattle, I made sure to actually read the HOA bylaws for my new condo building before signing the purchase agreement. I attended the first few board meetings to get a sense of how things were run and who was in charge. I never wanted to be caught off guard again by someone abusing their authority, and I wanted to make sure my new community was the kind of place where residents looked out for each other rather than looking for violations to report. Thankfully, my Seattle HOA was run by reasonable people who viewed their roles as service rather than power. The meetings were efficient and focused on actual community needs. When disputes arose, they were handled with common sense and a genuine attempt to find solutions that worked for everyone involved. It was everything that Meadowbrook Estates should have been during the Patricia Henderson years. Sometimes I would drive past neighborhoods in Seattle and see HOA signs posted at the entrances, and I would wonder what kind of leaders ran those communities. Were they like Robert, dedicated public servants trying to make their neighborhoods better? Or were they like Patricia, using their positions to feed their need for control and validation? There was no way to know from the outside, but I hoped most fell into the first category. The snow pile incident also taught me about the importance of choosing your battles carefully. I could have let Patricia's demands slide, shoveled her driveway, and avoided all the drama that followed. It would have been easier in the short term, but it also would have enabled her behavior and probably emboldened her to make even more outrageous demands in the future. By standing up to her early, even in a somewhat childish way, I had drawn a line that needed to be drawn. Of course, I also could have handled things more maturely. I could have simply refused her demand, cited the actual bylaw language, and submitted a formal complaint without the snow pile theatrics. That probably would have achieved the same result with less drama. But there was something satisfying about the poetic justice of giving Patricia exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. Sometimes, a little bit of creative problem solving makes the point more effectively than straightforward confrontation. In the end, the story of the HOA snow pile became a reminder that regular people have more power than they often realize when dealing with petty tyrants. It just requires the courage to say no, the diligence to verify claims against actual rules, and sometimes a willingness to think outside the box when it comes to compliance. Patricia Henderson had been counting on my ignorance and intimidation to get her way, and when I called her bluff with documentation and determination, her entire system of control collapsed. The neighborhood that emerged from the ashes of her presidency was stronger and healthier for having gone through that conflict. People felt empowered to speak up when they disagreed with HOA decisions. Board members knew they would be held accountable for their actions. And everyone learned that the rules applied equally to leaders and regular homeowners alike. These were valuable lessons, even if they came at the cost of some uncomfortable confrontations and hurt feelings. Looking back on the whole experience from the distance of several years and several hundred miles, I could see how all the pieces had fit together. Patricia's need for control had eventually pushed her too far, picking the wrong person to bully on the wrong day. My background as an engineer had made me naturally inclined to check her claims against the actual documentation rather than taking her word for it. And the built-up resentment from other homeowners had created an environment where the board was ready to act once someone finally brought concrete evidence of misconduct. If any of those factors had been different, the outcome might have been too. If I had been more compliant or less meticulous, if the board had been more loyal to Patricia or less concerned about their liability, if other homeowners had not been willing to come forward with their own stories, then maybe Patricia would still be HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates, still bullying her neighbors and inventing bylaws to suit her purposes. But that was not what happened. Instead, a simple dispute over snow removal became a catalyst for positive change in a community that desperately needed it. And while I never would have chosen to be at the center of such drama, I was glad I had stood my ground when it mattered. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do, and you just have to trust that the truth will win out in the end. The snow eventually melted, both literally and metaphorically. Spring came to Minnesota as it always did, and life in Meadowbrook Estates moved forward. The story became part of neighborhood lore, a tale told to new residents and a reminder of lessons learned. And somewhere in a storage unit in Seattle, I still have a framed printout of Section 12.7 of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws, a souvenir from the time I went to war with an HOA Karen over snow removal, and somehow came out on top. It hangs in my home office now, right next to my engineering degrees and family photos. Visitors sometimes ask about it, and I get to tell the story again, usually with a few embellishments of my own by this point. The core truth remains the same, though. I refused to shovel an HOA president's driveway based on fake bylaws, creatively complied with her demands in a way she did not expect, and accidentally started a revolution that improved my entire neighborhood. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to clear his own driveway in peace on a snowy Tuesday morning in January.